we're going to talk about, we are going to talk about the last group of political prisoners who were sent to Australia as convicts. And they were Fenians. Fenians. I'm talking about the last shipload of convicts and political prisoners which came to West Australia in February 1968. 1868, thank you. I'll keep you on your toes because I like criticism. But the interesting thing is that most of you know who the Fenians are, but do you know where their name is derived from? Gillian. No. Yeah, but we're not going to ask her.
Fairyland.
Exactly. Fairyland. Fianna. In the Gaelic text, there were these mythical warriors which protected the island of Erin, which was Ireland. They were the Fianna. So when the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed, they took on the name Fenian because, like Australia in the 1880s and 1890s, they were just rediscovering their origin stories. Okay? So, remember last time we spoke about the young Irish rebellion of 1848, the people who were sent across to Australia as convicts and those who came across with their own free will after the failure of that rebellion. Well, in many regards, what happened in 1848 and the creation of the Fenians is totally interrelated, with many of the same personalities being involved in that struggle. So I'll initially go back to Ireland, look at the background, why these people are transported, and then we look at what happened to West Australia. So, with the failure of the Irish Republic in 1848 and the acceptance of most of their intelligentsia to their demons land, what happened is that the Irish Confederation, which was a conglomeration of different Irish groups, non-sectarian groups, which were fighting for independent Ireland, which had come together. The loss of the Irish rebellion meaning they broke apart. And what happened is some of the major players escaped to Paris in 1848. One of the major players was a gentleman, a person called James Stephen, who escaped to Paris. Now, the thing about previous Irish revolutions is, to a large degree, they were initiated and carried out by the Irish aristocracy, and most of the Irish aristocracy converted to Anglicanism to maintain their estates after Cromwell invasion. You remember when I was talking about John O'Brien, the leader of the 1848 revolution? We put out a call. This is the height of the potato famine, when 1 million Irish had died at a population of 8 million in a 3-year period, that property rights were not to be usurped. So, Stephen goes to Paris. There he meets some unsavory characters who were involved in underground revolutionary activity. And in St. Patrick's Day's all day, 1858.
March 17th.
Yes, thank you. All days, what happened is that the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed. They had 2 branches, both independent of each other. One was in New York, which raised the money. One was in Dublin. Now, James Stephens came back to Britain in 1853, before the Brotherhood was set up. And he tried to organise the Brotherhood in military terms. And I'll give you a quote which shows how the revolutionary movement switched from an aristocratic-led fight for independence, but not social reform, to a social reform movement which was based on land redistribution which relied on the middle and working class. And the quote when the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed, not 1858, was this: "We do not appeal to the aristocracy. They are the willing tools of an alien government whose policy is to slay the people or, like noxious weeds, drive them from the soil." So in the revolution of 1848, there were two phenomena of India. So what James Stephens tried to do with the formation of the Republican Brotherhood was to create an underground group. His primary aim was to push out the British through the Union Islands. That was their primary aim. Violent revolution, social revolution, which was non-sectarian, open to both Catholics, Protestants, and whatever else, but which wanted major land redistribution and army. So the way they went about it was totally different to revolutions previously, which were more like popular uprisings. This was a calculated, hard-driven attempt to create an underground revolutionary group.
Ask a question.
We don't do questions till the end. Sorry. Because it breaks the flow. Right?
Go on.
All the questions.
No problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, go
Because
on.
it all interlinks, right?
Yeah.
I do this without notes. So, in 1858, when he came back for 5 years, they started organising. Once the Irish Republican Brotherhood was formed, it was formed on the basis of Stephen himself appointing a colonel. A colonel will then appoint 10 captains. The 10 captains will appoint 10 sergeants. The 10 sergeants will appoint 10 soldiers. That gave you a core group of 820 people. And what they were trying to do is create core groups of 820 potential revolutionaries all over Ireland. That's what they were trying to do. So this type of organisation is the type of organisation, although it's underground, it becomes infiltrated by informers. It basically breaks down because it's relying on a centralised authority. At the same time, they also made another classic order, actually self-used, right? The Irish voice. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, why was the Irish Republican Brotherhood formed in 1858? Because the aristocracy, the Irish aristocracy, had knifed the Irish people. Because remember Charles Gavin Duffy, the editor of The Nation, newspaper The Nation, was tried 5 times under the Government Treason Act and 5 times found not guilty. Remember he came to Victoria, practiced as a barrister, and became the 11th Premier of Victoria in 1871. Well, at that particular point in time, the Irish Parliament had been moulded into the British Parliament. And the Irish people had 48 representatives in the British Parliament. And after the 1852 election, they held a balanced parliament between between the Whigs and the Tories. And the policy was to create an independent Ireland through constitutional means. Now, what happened is that the Federation of Irish Parliamentarians, which you remember, Irish parliamentarians were not voted on one person, one vote, like for large landholders, candidates. What happened is the coalition broke apart. It was the British aristocracy were able to buy many of these Irish representatives. So they lost the balance of power. And that's when Charles Gavin Duffy threw a hissy fit, sold the nation, because he'd been stabbed in the back by his colleagues, came to Australia. So what we've seen is the attempt to get a constitutional independence for Ireland failed completely. And that was the impetus that was required to form an Irish Republican Brotherhood, because all parliamentary options had been removed. It was the Irish, and that's where that slogan, that sentence comes from. We do not appeal to the aristocracy because they are the willing tokens of alien government. This policy is to slay the people, who drive them like noxious vermin from the soil. And then the last sentence was, the people must save themselves. That was the key. The people must save themselves. So what happened is, from aristocratic or upper class type of independence revolution, we now had a revolution, or a potential revolution, which was based on middle class and working people taking up the cudgel because the aristocracy, the Irish aristocracy, had failed to beat. Right? But at the same time, they went on a very important recruitment campaign. Because 30% of the British Army consisted of Irish men. 30% of the British Army. That's a huge number, and obviously they needed. And if you look at the history of Australia, even the history of Eureka is very interesting. I'll just mention one of the things. In the history of the Eureka Rebellion, the Irish were on both sides. They were in the Eureka stockade, they were in the redcoats. And what happened is two brothers found themselves in the stockade, got their brother who was a redcoat to actually defend. But that's not the story which I'll speak about. I'm just saying it's the division. So the British aristocracy relied on Irish working class people who needed work to keep the empire afloat. Now you've got to remember, in 1858 there was a big hiccup in the British Empire's expansion when there was the Indian Mutiny, which led to the death of over 800,000 Indians over two period. So the Irish Republican Brotherhood, understanding they needed arms, ammunition, men and transport to conduct a successful revolution, decided to infiltrate the British Armed Forces, both in England and in Ireland. And what happened is they appointed a gentleman, wasn't a gentleman, I can assure you, John Devoy as their chief recruiter in the British Army. And John Devoy had actually joined the French Foreign Legion because he couldn't stomach the idea of working for the British to learn military skills. And he was a very skilled activist. And at one stage in British history in the 1870s, he was described as the most dangerous enemy in the country. So John Devoy goes about recruiting soldiers in Ireland and England. And it is said, and you can't verify this, 8,000 British soldiers with Irish heritage swore the Fenian oath. Now, when they made the mistake of forming the Irish Voice, what happened is that their major cadres were actually the editorial staff of the Irish Voice, because it's a centralised organisation in which people outside that centralised authority. And obviously this made it very easy for the British authorities to actually infiltrate and learn their plans for a rebellion in 1866. So the British forces struck first. They closed down the Irish Voice and used, remember, the Treason-felony Act of a few decades ago, which made it illegal. It was illegal to advocate by voice or print violent revolution in Ireland. And that's what they were doing in 1848. And so the Treason-felony Act was introduced. The newspaper was closed down in February 1866, and the back of the movement was broken. Even John Stephen was arrested, He was freed from jail and escaped to Paris. Now, at the same time, John Devoy is recruiting. Everybody's waiting for the sign. The sign, the magic day when the rebellion will occur. At the same time, we have thousands of Irish Americans pouring in to Ireland, waiting for the signal because they've been involved in the American Civil War, which had just finished. 200,000 Irish involved in the American Civil War, in specific Irish battalions. They were battle hardened. Remember, over 1 million people died, soldiers died in the American Civil War. They were battle hardened. Now, interestingly, in 1790, almost 100 years previously, Lord Cornwallis said, they leave with a spade, and they will leave with a spade. This is the Irish immigrants. There's running millions immigrant to America, and they will return with a musket. So in the 1860s, they returned fully armed because the New York faction of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, its main task was to raise money, purchase arms, and provide soldiers for the rebellion. So the British authorities, who now had all the information which made the background for the Irish voice, knew that the Americans that were pouring in back into Ireland were there waiting for a signal for revolutionary activity. So what did they do? In September 1866, they suspended habeas corpus. What that means is that if habeas corpus is suspended, you can detain without trial and without charge.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. So all the US immigrants they could find were rounded up and imprisoned. Now, by this time, people had lost faith in James Stephen's ability to actually coordinate the line and carry out the revolution, and he was removed from the leadership. And the 5th of March, 1867, was designated as the day for revolt, which started in Dublin. It was soon crushed because in September 1866, guess what had happened? The British authorities had a list of British servicemen who were Fenians, and they arrested over 150 of them and imprisoned them. So they broke the back of the rebellion. So it was a little bit stupid for the Irish Republican Brotherhood to go ahead with the rebellion on the 5th of March. So it was a total failure. Okay? So what happens when you fail to rebel? You know the old saying, he who digs, or she who digs, or it who digs, makes a half a revolution, digs their own brain. So there are hundreds of civilian prisoners, and there are 150 prisoners from the British Army, Irish troops. The civilian prisoners were tried in special commissions, and most of them were actually sentenced to serve time in British and Irish jail. Well, the 150 troops who'd been arrested were court-martialed, and they were sentenced to periods from 5 to 10 to life imprisonment. Now, at the end of the trials in 1868, we had 67 the revolution. At the end of the trials, by 1868, there were 17 of the soldiers had been sentenced to death, right? Firing squad, because they were considered to be double traitors. Not only were they traitors to the British Crown, they were also traitors to their regiment. Because any of you who've had any military experience realise that your relationship with your regiment is fundamental to your survival. And that's something which is run into your head. I'm sure Vic will tell us later on, from day one. You owe this allegiance to the regiment.
It's almost religious.
It's the religion, it's the mission statement. So what are we going to do with these 17 hardened criminals who've been sentenced to life in prison? They were going to be executed, but they didn't want martyrs. I mean, the history of Ireland, that was spoken in the past, is full of martyrs. They didn't want martyrs. So, 45 of the civilian prisoners and the 17 army personnel were put on a ship and sent to Australia. Now, the problem is that by that time, nobody in Australia wanted any convicts. And on this ship, because the convicts, the transportation had ceased in West Australia.
So
Sorry,
they've had enough. They've had enough.
my finish. Transportation had ceased in Queensland, but it ceased in New South Wales. It had ceased in Van Diemen's Land. There was minimal transportation to Victoria and no transportation to Australia. The last place that needed labour was West Australia. So on the last ship, there were 350 convicts, 17 of the soldiers, and 45 civilian people involved in the revolt in Dublin. And they were sent to Perth, they were sent to Fremantle. Right? Now, they got on really well on the ship. They even produced, and this is the Irish disease, they produced their own magazine on the ship called The Wild Goose, right? It is a long journey. They left in September, didn't arrive till February 1868. You know, it's a long journey, 6 months.
Right, yeah.
So they set up their own little newspaper.
Right.
So, but the trouble was that on the way to Australia, things happened in England. There was an attempt to release one of the colonels from a British prison which went haywire, and the explosion was a little bit stronger than people expected, and the explosion killed 12 British people. No, this was on land. There's nothing to do with the ship. This is on land. So on land in Britain, there was this, while they were on the ship, there was this attempt to free one of the colonels from one of the jails at Cloakham. And what happened is the explosion, they were amateurs, the explosion was much stronger than they expected. There was a village which was next to the prison. 12 people were killed, working people, and 105 were injured. So by this time, although there'd been some popular support for the Fenians, that supported Wayne. To make matters worse, in Sydney, guess what happened? Well, they were on a ship arriving for the Wild Goose. Mr. O'Farrell, a demented Irishman, tried to assassinate Prince Alfred at Hougoumont in Sydney. And he was saved by his braces because the bullet lodged in his braces, in the metal in his braces. So here we have a ship full of these terrorists coming to West Australia. The governor of West Australia, this is the beauty of Australian history, the governor of West Australia at that particular time was shaking in his boots. His name was Dr. Hampton. I don't know if you remember Dr. Hampton from the 1848 Revolution. Well, Dr. Hampton was the doctor in Van Diemen's Land whose job it was to inflict punishment on the young Irish rebels who were in prison. He's the one who, made the sort of solitary confinement, how much food they can eat, ration.
Okay.
So Paul,
I'll talk to you.
Paul, Dr. Hamilton is very concerned. So he demands protection from these terrorists that are coming to West Australia. And he gets two extra companies of troops and a gunboat. This is for 65 Fenian Rising. They eventually arrive, and punishment consists of 6 months solitary confinement for the first 6 months, and then it's general duties. So when they arrived, there was a person on the ship who was a bit of a Houdini. And this was a young man called John Boyle White, He was a journalist, a poet, and an athlete. And he escaped from three. He was one of the soldiers. He was a member of the 10th Hussar group in Ghana. He escaped from three different prisons in England. Dartmoor was one of them. So he arrives in Fremantle. He says to everyone, "The 11th February 1868, I'll be gone by 1869." All right? Everybody laughed. It was a very harsh punishment. Now, the British authorities were very interesting. They knew how to curtail revolt. You prison people, and then you pardon them. And although people had arrived in 1868, in 1869 there was a general pardon for the civilian prisoners involved in the insurrection. So those 45 were pardoned. But the Duke of Cambridge said vehemently that the soldiers were dying in chains because these were all lifers. Because you can't have this example. Because you've got this lack of discipline in the British Armed Forces, they lose their capacity to maintain their colonies. So guess what? In February 1869, John Riley escapes from Fremantle prison. That's his story. He gets into a rowboat. He'd organised for a priest, friendly priest, for an American whaler to pick him up, right, in the middle of the international waters. So he rows, and gets to 3 miles, and the whaler didn't turn up. He didn't have any food, didn't have any water, in the rowboat. The whaling captain had pocketed the money, but decided it wasn't worth the effort. So this is a very lucky man. He's kind of rolling around in his boat, dying of dehydration, and he gets picked up on an American ship, which takes him to the US of A, where he was fated as a hero. He was an escape from an unescapable prison, which was the Fremantle solitary. Okay? Now, by 1876, all civilian prisoners had been pardoned in 1869 and 1871, and some of the soldiers either died or were pardoned. So there were 8 soldiers left in prison. Now remember John Devoy was spoken of. Now John Devoy was pardoned in 1871 on the undertaking that he would be exiled. This is the main recruiter in the armed forces, public enemy number 1 as far as the British Empire is concerned. So when he gets to New York, they're looking for a new leader for their major Republican group, which is called Clan Naarm. Clan Naarm. And he takes up the leadership because the leadership was offered to, guess who? John Mitchell, one of the Irish rebels. Remember John Mitchell was the Irish rebel who sided with the slave owners in the Civil War. Now, at the same time, in 1870, this is fascinating, the Irish Americans invaded Canada. That's right. They felt that if they destabilised Canada, then they can have a revolt in Ireland. It was a total fiasco. 2,000 people were supposed to turn up. Only 200 had turned up. So the Fenians were the laughing stock of New York. So it was John Devoy's job to rehabilitate the Fenian, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, US of A. Now in 1876 he gets this letter, secret letter from Fremantle jail, from the 8 supposedly the 8 people that left Fremantle jail, which says, remember, this is a letter from the tomb. Think that for the last nearly 9.5 years, we have been in this living tomb. On behalf of my comrades and myself, I ask you to help us. Signed, James Wilson. Right? It was one of the 8. Secret letter from Fremantle jail. from the 8, well, supposedly the 8 life in the left. Fremantle jail, which says, says, remember, this, this is a letter from the tomb. Think that for the last nearly 9.5 years, we have been in this living tomb. On behalf of my comrades and myself, I ask you to help us. Signed, James Wilson. Right? It was one of the 8. Now, John Devoy was a man of principle, contacted, mobilised the funds from Gale. Because the good thing about the American Irish rebels is that the Irish rebels in Ireland had nothing but had a lot of money. So he mobilised, they organised a secret attempt to spring these Irish rebels from Fremantle prison. So he contacted our good friend, the great escape artist, John Boyle O'Reilly, and with his assistance, they came up with this brilliant idea. They were going to buy a ship, 200 tonnes, which was called the Catalpa, Catalpya. They outfitted it as a whaler. They appointed a captain who they told what they wanted to do. The captain's called George Anthony. He was 31-year-old adventurer. The whaling ship was crewed mainly by Malays and people from Cape Verde Islands. Right? So off they go whaling. Okay, they catch some whale, send it all back, and keep going south. The crew gets a little bit suspicious because there are no whales south. They're wondering what's going on. But, you know, they didn't ask too many questions. At the same time, John Devoy and John O'Reilly had organised for 2 Irish Republican stalwarts to go to West Australia. One was called Thomas Desmond, and the other one was called John Breslin. Now, John Breslin appears in Perth as an investor. Remember, this is a colony which is failing. He's there as an investor. The new governor, George Robinson, is really taken up by this swashbuckling investor. Now, John Breslin will help a number of the Irish rebels escape to the USA. At the same time, not to arouse suspicion, there's another Irishman called Thomas Desmond from San Francisco who went to Perth. And he wasn't an investor, but he was interested in purchasing a few things. So Thomas Desmond's job was to organise the escape. Now, John Breslin was such an effective con man that he even got a tour of Fremantle prison to look at these Irish prisoners. At the same time, George Robinson, the governor of West Australia, invited George Anthony, the captain of the Catalpa, and Mr. Breslin to lunch at Government House with him. Pleasant lunch was held, and 2 days later, they put the plan into action. They cut the telegraph line. Remember, I hadn't said since the telegraph between Fremantle and Perth. The 6 of the 8 soldier convicts ran off from the work parties with a bit of assistance. Were put onto coaches which had been pre-organised by Mr. Desmond and taken to Rockingham Beach, about 30 kilometres away from Fremantle, awaiting a rowboat from the Catalpa, which is in international waters 3 miles from Perth. Now, by this time, the story of their escape was circulating. Now, as I said before, there were 8. Now, I know about 7, but I've never been able to track what happened to the 8 persons. The 6 people that escaped were Robert Cranston, Thomas Darrigar, Michael Harrington, Thomas Haslett, It was Robert Morgan and James Wilson. One gentleman of the 8 wasn't told about this escape, and that was John Ryan. And why wasn't John Ryan told by the others? Because they all believed he was a police friend. So he was left behind. And I've got no idea who the 8th person was. I haven't been able to verify whether he actually existed or not. But I do know that 2 days later, George Anthony arrives with the rowboat. They jump on the rowboat and they start running towards the cattle. At the same time, the police boat from Perth appears and chases them. Right? They make it by about 20 metres to the cattle, which is in international waters. They jump on board and they're waiting for the police boat to try to board them. But it didn't, because they knew it was international waters, and that was that. Now, the governor was really pissed off, because not only had he let the prisoners escape, he'd been made a total fool of by Breslin and Desmond. So what he did, he sent out a gunship, the Georgette, which was based in Perth, to capture the cattle, the whaling boat. They eventually found them in international waters. They fired across their bows and they said, surrender. George Anthony said, I'm in international waters. I don't care what you do. And then he threw up the United States flag and said, shoot if you want to.
Wow.
They decided to withdraw. They didn't want international diplomacy, so they escaped to New York. And now I think we're his heroes. So this is an impossible escape. If you go to Rockingham Beach, if you ever go to Fremantle,
Yeah.
go to Rockingham Beach, there is a monument to their escape
Right.
at Rockingham Beach. Now, I want to talk about John Devoy, because he's the only one who saw anything in the as I said, John Devoy by this time was declared to be Great Britain's greatest enemy, public enemy number 1. Now, John Devoy was born during the famine, and he, as a little boy, remembered famine and the death and destruction. And he never forgave the English, because the Irish slogan was, God gave us the right, the British landlords gave us the famine. Because the potato blight was across Europe, the only place that had a famine was Ireland, because the food was exported, not the fact there wasn't any food, it was being exported to England, because they were concerned about their own problems in 1848, with the era of revolutions in Europe. Chartists were involved in revolts, so they wanted to feed the British people at the expense of the Irish. And remember, the Irish population was 8 million, and within 3 years, it was reduced to 5. Now, what happened is 1 million died of starvation, 500,000 died of associated disease, and another million immigrated to the USA. This is the crowd that departed with a spade and came back with a musket. So John Devoy is a man who's, big stuff. So let's go up to 1916. Now remember, Clan Nagale is the primary which underwrites any revolutionary army. Ireland provides the men, they provide the majority of the army. Now, at the height of First World War, he organises with the Germans to carry a shipload of weapons to Dublin for the Easter Rebellion. Unfortunately for John, the ship gets boarded, the weapons never get to Dublin. So in 1916, you had the failed Easter Rebellion. Remember, John Devoy was born in 1852. Right? Guess what? 1924, the Irish Free State was formed, without the 6 northern counties, right? Guess who was the guest of honour at the celebrations in Ireland? John Devoy. Isn't that extraordinary? Of all the people I've spoken about involved in the 1848 and the rebellion in 1867, he was the only one who saw the fruits of their labour, which is the Irish Republic. He died an old man at the age of 82 in 1921. Now, Mr. Boyle O'Reilly, was interesting because when he got to America, he realised the American dream was being built on the labour and the blood and the sweat and the tears of Irish immigrants. And he formed another newspaper, the Boston Pilot. They love doing newspapers, the Irish. It's all virtual platforms these days. The Boston Pilot to actually expose what was actually happening amongst the Irish in America. It wasn't all beer and skills for everyone. So we've looked at the groups, we've looked at 9 different groups of political prisoners that come across. 3 of them, the groups were Irish. You had the failed Irish rebellion in 1798, which saw about 300 rebels come to Australia. Then you had the failed Young Ireland rebellion in 1848, where you had about 7 or 8 the primary organisers sent as convicts to Australia. And then you had the Fenian rebellion in 1866, and resulting in the aftermath of 62 Fenians sent to Perth on the last convict ship. Questions?
I was thinking about the 1848 revolution time, and I think there was a ferment around that time, so it wasn't just what was happening in Ireland. It was momentum maybe from the...
It helped. In 1848, the Bourbons, the hated Bourbons, were overthrown in France, right?
Yeah.
That led to a call for revolutionary activity across Europe. It all failed.
Yeah.
They all failed.
Yeah.
But that momentum
Yeah.
did promote the young Irish rebels to actually attempt
Yeah.
change before.
Yeah.
No, they attempted change in the middle of a famine. You can't have revolution in the middle of your famine.
Yeah, good point.
When people are dying,
Good
left,
point.
right, and
Yeah,
centre,
exactly.
men, women, and children.
Yeah.
So it was more of a many chiefs, no Indians, and that was the dilemmas.
Thank you.
Was there a part of that time where they wanted to take part of Australia?
Who?
There was an attempt, maybe there was an idea to take part.
No, the idea was to run away.
So, yeah.
It's convicts. The idea was to run away.
Was there another time they wanted to get a part of it?
Well, you may be thinking about when colonisation began in 1788, when the French were about 2 days late as far as they would have Port Jackson.
Oh my God, interesting.
But all the French
Oh my
speakers
God.
could have colonies.
Yeah.
We could go to New Caledonia.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would have been that period.
We'd have better food.
And you know, first Europeans, first Europeans in the Pacific Bay were French.
Yeah.
Settlements.
Did the Dutch not make it to?
The Dutch was a spent colonial force by then. The Dutch were mainly 16th and 17th century because you had the Portuguese and the Spaniards first.
Yeah.
Portuguese, colonised parts of Africa, they colonised Brazil, the Spaniards. It was only when Drake was legitimised as a pirate. They became a pirate fleet 150 years later, the British were involved. Then you had the battle between the French and the British for supremacy. Now the Dutch were the first the Portuguese were the first colonisers. That's why in East Timor they speak Portuguese, because they colonised that in the 1500s, early 1500s. That was colonised. But then the Dutch threw out the Portuguese. So when Australia was being expeditions going down the west coast, not the east coast, they were basically coming from Batavia in Java. So, and the Dutch held their colonies in Indonesia until after World War II. Then the Indonesians revolted when the Japanese were pushed out. And in 1967, the Netherlands left the last colony in the Pacific, which was that was just Dutch colonisation. So there's always different imperial powers at different times.
It's just that they held on like that Van Diemen for how long?
Who?
The Dutch.
The Dutch were living in Van Diemen.
It's too new for you.
What happened is, it's called Van Diemen's Land because Abel Tasman ordered that when he first went through the Straits. He called it Van Diemen's Land, which changed to Tasmania about 200 years later. So when the convicts were going in, it was still described as Van Diemen's.
Or New Holland.
Well, New Holland was the east coast.
Uh-huh.
Tasmania was Van Diemen's.
What about the New Holland honey user?
East Coast. I mean,
Yes, Tasmania too.
They pretty much got to the top of the Australian, so there's nothing here. Is that true?
Well, if you look at the notes of William Dampier, he said he saw the most miserable wretches on the planet on the West Australian coast. So the thing is, when you're a coloniser, you're looking for gold and spices, right? You come to the west coast of Australia, there's no gold and spices, it's just desert. You come to the east coast of Australia, there's no gold and spices. And the only reason the east coast was colonised by the British was to set up penal settlement to get rid of all their troublemakers. Whether they were troublemakers who created the economic situation or whether they were rebels and radicals and revolutionaries. That's what it was set up. So in many ways, we were the Guantanamo Bay
Yeah.
of British Empire. Sorry.
no, I'm going to say I was a British troublemaker. I had to pay my own fare.
Oh,
You didn't even get a £10 pulp.
No, I had to pay.
How come?
I was out later and they'd stopped the £10 on.
We had enough of you more.
I beg pardon.
We had enough of you more.
Yeah, yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting about the £10.
Did you come with interest?
I was interested in lots of things. Yeah.
It's interesting.
no regret.
Those people who are involved in union activity will remember if you're involved in the 50s and 60s, you had the Tommy Union Delegate, who everybody was down in. Now, these were unionists from England who actually demanded rights for the workers they represented. And the way they were denigrated was, well, he's just a comic. Whinging from the union. Any more questions before we close the TV? I mean, I've done nine series. I was only going to do 9. I think most of them are fine.
Have you ever lost treasures? Lost
You're a lost treasure.
Any lost maps?
Well, there's the story about what is the ship that you know, you know, the ship that the wooden one, what is it, the mahogany ship.
Oh, the one that disappears.
They all think it was a Portuguese ship, although some people think it was a Chinese junk.
What state? Did it sink here somewhere?
Warrnambool.
I'm right in.
Well, people claimed in the 80s
Yeah.
it was uncovered in the sea. Maybe there's treasure there. There are people still looking for it.
That's
Jazz, maybe you can join them. We'll take 10%. There's all these stories about Chinese coins being found, Chinese game. Yes, you've got to remember this. Indonesia, Australia were very close together. The Dutch had been there. And remember, the Indonesians from Sulawesi had been coming to North Australia for hundreds of years. They had a trading relationship with the northern Arnhem Land Aboriginal groups. There are many words in Arnhem languages which are Indonesian words. There are words in Sulawesi which have Aboriginal connotation. And it all revolves around the trepang. They would be allowed to hunt trepang for 3 months of the year.